something besides just feeding hungry people like many of these ministries do in our county, and like we do with a number of the things that our church has. My guess is it may be hard for some of us to imagine what it's like to buy at a thrift store or to receive help from a church. Though as I look around this room, it's not unfamiliar to all of us. I've seen some of you in thrift stores when I've been in there doing my shopping. But it's probably hard for most of us, or would be, to receive help from a place, even in a familiar place like this community, if we grew up here. It may be difficult to receive help in a familiar place. Maybe it's easier if you don't live here to get help in one's home, or in a place other than one's hometown. Similar case exists in the passage that we heard as the prophet Isaiah calls to the people in a time of exile in Babylon. They're not in their hometown. Many of them by now have put down roots in this, what was once a strange land. Much the way immigrants come to our country seeking a new way of living and become somewhat enculturated with their work and their service. They contribute to the well-being of their adopted country while also getting an education, establishing or worshiping in houses of worship with their families, whatever those families look like, serving both the social and spiritual needs of their families. For these Jewish people in Babylon, many have become accustomed to their way of living. They've taken on a way of life that was customary for the country they went into, that was customary for life in Babylon. But like my purchases at a thrift store, even the really great finds, I wonder if they were satisfied. For some, Isaiah's call to a journey home isn't easy to imagine because they become accustomed to life in Babylon. For others, it may well be a journey that'll bring satisfaction for them. The passage reminds the people that a previous journey to the promised land of satisfaction was characterized as they were hungry by manna coming down from heaven, a sort of bread that didn't really satisfy them. In fact, for about the whole 40 years they were wandering around toward the promised land, they were complaining most of the time about the manna. Oh, I shouldn't say that. That's a little unfair to say, but they had their problems with getting this bread in this way, this manna that didn't satisfy. And that's what the prophet reminds them of and says, this journey, though, you're going to return. You're going back to the promised land. This will be a journey like a feast compared with the journey you took before to the promised land. This next journey, the prophet says, will be in a way and to a place that does satisfy. Well, as I think about this passage and where the people are and what Isaiah is saying to them, I find the atmosphere in our country at a similar sort of exilic crossroads. Our own journey as a nation leaves a lot to be desired right now for many. In Washington, they argue about increasing taxes for those needing public assistance, living in poverty, and they argue about providing public assistance for those living in extravagance. The funny thing to me is that when money is given to those living in poverty, it's called public assistance or welfare or entitlements. But when it's given to General Motors or Chrysler or Wachovia, it's a bailout. What's the difference? And I'm not judging either. I think both have been necessary. I don't know where we would be if corporations hadn't gotten assistance from the government, but let's call it the same. That's what it is. It's assistance, public assistance. There was a time, you see, when poverty was seen as a sign of God's disfavor, or worse, as a sign that one had not only failed to do the right thing, but had willfully committed some sort of wrong, payment for which one's lot in life was poverty, economic and social poverty, onto which all sorts of judgment was heaped and still is, unfortunately. When I hear arguments in favor of tax cuts for the rich, like bailouts for corporations and cuts of public assistance for people living below the level of economic poverty, I have to wonder, what does a passage like this have to say to that? How does our faith speak to those situations going on in our lives around us? Isaiah speaks of the buying without cost or money. And not just some food, but great food, really good food. It's a call to those that have no money to come buy and eat rich food, milk and wine. But alas, the prophet becomes the poet. At a time when many of the people were down and worn out and weary hope of ever returning to the relationships they once had known, had faded beyond recognition. And so the prophet, normally known for chastising and challenging and exhortation, takes on a tender side. Rather than a word of judgment, he gives a word of comfort, a word of hope. I believe there's a word of comfort and hope for us in this as well. By reminding the people of the covenant God has made with them, he calls them to a new way of relating. Inasmuch as the passage and the prophet calls into our own debates about wealth and poverty, hunger and satisfaction. Why do you work so hard for that which doesn't satisfy? I'm reminded of the words of Jesus. What does it profit one to gain the whole world and lose one's own soul? So the question comes up for me, at what price do we continue down this road of separating ourselves out into us and them, rich and poor? Of seeing and judging the poor and the immigrant to be less than or somehow at fault for the economic woes that have come. These woes come not because poor people or immigrants don't carry their weight, but because those with the means to help make things right usually zone out and end up making things better only for themselves. At what price to the well-being of this nation do we continue down a road that leads us back into wilderness and dead ends? At what price do we continue in this us and them theology, politics, and economics? At what price do we allow the state empire to dictate the way we relate with each other? We've already allowed it in a large way last May by letting it come to a vote whether churches ought to decide who gets married rather than the state or the state of North Carolina. But now the very idea of putting a pink stripe on the driver's licenses of some of the people that live in this state is appalling to me. To single out people who are here illegally by putting a pink stripe on their driver's license reminds me of Nazi Germany and the denotation of the Jews with the stars of David sewn prominently on their outer as well as their inner garments. And you say, wait a minute, preacher, back up just a little bit. Isn't that offensive to the people of the Holocaust? Doesn't that belittle the Holocaust? All right, that's a fair question. And with all due respect to my Jewish friends, let me tell you this story. I was in San Francisco 5 years ago, standing with friends outside the hotel on Castro Street. We're about halfway up the hill looking down Castro toward Market Street and Twin Peaks Tavern. And over the tavern was a flag flying with a pink Star of David on it. And I thought, that's odd to see a Star of David on Castro Street. A pink Star of David at that. I wonder what that means. So I asked my friends about it, who knew about these things. And Wayne Schwant told me, in Nazi Germany, gays were made to wear pink Stars of David. So I feel somewhat justified in my indignation at the suggestion that some people in this state ought to have pink stripes on their driver's licenses. Of course there are issues that need to be resolved with immigration. But the question is, how do we resolve them in a way that is true and faithful to this promise of God's presence and the way we relate with each other? Labeling and segregating seems to be the way we're hardwired to try things in relationship with people that we find to be different. And that's the way we've approached things in the past. And how has that worked out for us? It never seems to work out well. It always seems to farther divide us and create pain on both sides of the us and them equation. I wonder if maybe we should think about a new way of relating on this. For the Jewish people living in Babylon, their salvation will come. It'll be in the form of the Persians who take over Babylon, and Cyrus the Mede, or the Persian, will invent tolerance and say to the Jews, go back, if you like. Go back to Jerusalem. You don't have to stay here in exile. Go back and build your temple. And many of them will. Many of them will return to Jerusalem when Cyrus does this. Some will stay. But the interesting thing is that Cyrus will be called the Anointed of God. A term which is translated Messiah. It's in the Bible. Read your Bible. I know you don't believe me. That's a hard thing to believe. That's fine. Don't take my word for it. Find it out for yourself. It's in there. Cyrus does this, becomes God's anointed, God's Messiah. And this proves to be a pretty good indicator of this new feast God is about, a new way of being in relationship with each other. Here, lo and behold, is a conqueror who doesn't destroy. Here's a conqueror who just says, we can all get along here. I'm going to be in charge, he says, of course, but you can worship God as you need to. I don't believe in your God, but you do, and that's okay. Cyrus says this. We need this same sort of feast, this new way of being in relationship with each other in this state and in our country and in our world. This feast, as far as I can tell, that Isaiah is pointing the people to, this feast is about the way we relate with each other in what he calls, or what becomes known as Jesus will lift it up, as the kingdom of heaven. It's the way we relate with each other. Not so much a place, a location, but a way of being in relationship, and it's based on love. What if the actions that we took with our laws and our rules were based on love? I think that's all we ask as Christian people, at least in this church. Nearly 6 years ago, I took a 3-month sabbatical, and I asked Mark Johnson to teach my Sunday morning discussion class, and he did. The class he presented a program in which they studied poverty in this community, and they became acquainted with the faces of poverty among us. And at the end of the 12-week class, Mark asked the class, how do we make a faithful response to this? How do we make a faithful response to what we now know about poverty in our community? And the free pancake breakfast was born at Trinity. See, before that, we charged $5 a plate for it and almost went under with it. Had only about 25 or 30 people coming once a month, and it really wasn't worth the effort. We started doing it for free, and I think the first time they did it for free, there were 150 people here, and people gave donations that more than covered the expenses. In fact, to this day, the pancake breakfast funds the food expenses for my father's house family promise guests that we'll feed this week. That was the beginning of Trinity becoming known in this town as a church that relates in a different way with outsiders, with those that we perceive to be different from ourselves. Through these experiences, we see the faces of people living at the shelter. When you come to the pancake breakfast, you see people who are living in poverty. You might even sit with them at a table. You might even have a conversation with somebody who's a different color than you are or speaks a different language. And that changes the way we relate. When I hear the prophet's words and I see his images of a feast that satisfies, I know he isn't talking about a place or even a meal so much as an experience of relationship with that which is divine and eternal, and that relationship calls me into a journey of relationship with others, poor, rich, young, old, American, Mexican, Pakistani, Arab, Israeli, Palestinian, Korean, Japanese, Russian, gay, non-gay, citizen and non-citizen, and on, because in them too I experience the presence of the divine in my midst. I hope they experience that presence from me. Michael was saying a minute ago about the price Jesus paid, the cost, his life he gave for what he believed was the right way of relating in this world with each other and with God, the way of love, the way of humility. Maybe that's what the price is. Relating in a way of love and humility. So then there are thrift stores, and I'll end with that. My stepson Daniel a few days ago even showed me a video of a rap song called Thrift Shop. I started to play that for you today, and then I realized no, probably wouldn't be appropriate for this audience. Some of you know this song, don't you? And now you're all going to go out and find it, right? And then you're going to indict me for the language in it. Well, that's okay. There's a story in it. That's all I'm going to say. There's not just a rap tune about thrifting. There's a whole new language coming to be about shopping in thrift stores. For instance, the term fashionista. Do you know that term? It denotes somebody who wears the latest fashions which they buy at thrift stores. And while some, like Goodwill, even sell bread, getting by on thrift stores finally doesn't satisfy either. Unless, of course, those experiences transform the way we relate with each other. And they just may. What would it mean for us to spend our money and time on that which satisfies? This thing of relating with each other in love and humility and acceptance. Let's work on that. Amen.